Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Todd Green. I teach in the religion department at Luther College. I teach mostly European and American religious history, and I do research on Islamophobia. Mostly in Europe, and that's my primary area. I've particularly been studying the past several years the rise of the far right in Europe and far-right political parties and how they use immigration, and the words immigration and Muslims in Europe are synonymous for most Europeans. And how the targeting of immigrants and the targeting of Muslims is sort of a leverage that the far right uses to really gain strength. They've gained a lot of strength. Americans, if they paid more attention to European politics, would be surprised at the rise of far right parties and how much power they have started to acquire. So that's my initial sort of interest in Islamophobia, but because of my own broader teaching interest in where I live and that sort of thing, I actually compare and contrast Islamophobia on both sides of the Atlantic, so I have a lot of interest in what happens obviously here in the United States. And one point I always try to make is that what happens in the United States doesn't just stay in the United States. Things that happen here affect Muslims in other parts of the world, obviously, including in Europe. And events that happen on European soil will affect policies that take place here in the United States as well. So both sides of the Atlantic are actually quite relevant to this topic. Here is the U.S. Religious Composition 2007. Not a great in terms of the color scheme here. The big thing to show you is that the vast majority of Americans self-identify as Protestant. And you have Catholics here, that's divided right here. What you see here is the sliver over here is the percentage of Americans who would self-identify as Muslim. By 2010, the Pew Research Center estimates for 0.8% of the population is Muslim. You wouldn't think that compared to how much press they get. But in fact, Muslims make up a very small percentage of the population. I like to remind people of that in part because so much of Islamophobia will ramp up the rhetoric when it comes to Muslims taking over the United States, or I hear this in Europe all the time. In Europe, the percentage of Muslim residents are actually much higher than in the United States.
What would it be there?
Much higher.
How much higher?
It depends on the country. 7% or so in France, 6 to 7% in Germany, about 5%, 6% in Switzerland, the Netherlands, compared to 0.8%. The Muslim population in Europe, compared to the non-Muslim population, has been rising for a couple of decades. Some of that's just because the European birth rate is incredibly low. But I think it's always important to start off with how many people are really talking about it. It seems like in most, thank you, Mel, sorry. Most of the slides that Mel was showing us, like they have taken almost all 0.8% of the population and tried it in some cases, it seems like. What is Islamophobia? This is actually a term that entered into political discourse and debate back in the late 90s in Britain. So it was introduced in Britain, now it's sort of been imported in the United States as well. This is a think tank, a British think tank that was charged to study racism in Britain in the late 90s. Initially focusing on anti-Semitism and other forms of racism, but eventually spread that to include Muslims living in Britain as well. And so according to the Runnymede report, which is always quoted for people who study Islamophobia, this is the short definition of Islamophobia: an outlook or worldview involving unfounded dread and dislike of Muslims, which results in practices of exclusion and discrimination. So if you wanted a definition, that's the official one that's there. These are the building blocks of Islamophobia according to that report. This is, again, back in the late 90s on the other side of the Atlantic. But for people like me who study Islamophobia, we work with these. These are the sort of what often kind of considered the building blocks of Islamophobia. Starting with the first one, which may not seem like a significant one, but in my opinion, this one ties it all together. It's sort of the glue that holds the other 7 together. The idea that Islam is monolithic. It doesn't change. If your fundamental premise is that Islam doesn't change, and therefore anyone plugged into Islam doesn't change, Muslims, then whatever else you can convince a population of about Muslims, you're also going to convince that population that they're not going to change. If you're violent, if Islam is portrayed as inherently violent and it's monolithic, Islam will always be violent, right? So that's why that first one's important. This idea that Christianity and Judaism and other religions, they adapt and they change and they nuance their teachings and they interact with broader teachings and they modernize themselves. that doesn't apply to Islam. Islam is sort of the exception. That's what we're talking about with monolithic.
They don't know much about Shiites and Sunnis then, do they?
Well, yeah, the whole idea of knowledge about Islam is another topic. But yeah, it's not to mention yeah, knowing the history of Islamic thought. But that starting point is extremely important, and that is very prevalent in Western perceptions of Islam. That Islam simply does not have the ability to change or adapt. So keep that in the back of your mind, right? Second, it lacks common values with other cultures. An example here would be gender equality. Islam is inherently misogynist. It's inherently oppressive of women, unlike the United States, which is very, you know, on the front burner, right, when it comes to women's rights. And so this idea that it lacks common values, that Islam in the West, Islamic values, Western values, they just simply don't go together. It's inferior to the West, it's backwards in terms of invoking reason, it's backwards in terms of scientific achievements. Islam is just pre-modern, even though we're in the 21st century, right? So therefore it must be inherently inferior to West and Western values. That Islam and the West are prone to a clash of civilizations. This was a phrase coined by a political scientist some decades ago named Samuel Huntington. The notion that in the post-Cold War era, what we really see is a clash of civilizations, and the two big civilizations, among others, discussed by Huntington are Islam and the West. And this would sort of dictate global politics in the post-Cold War era. Is this been a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy or whatever? That's another topic too, but that phrase is thrown out there an awful lot. Islam is a political ideology, not a religion. I in my own research encountered this a lot in Europe, but it's also here in the U.S. as well. This notion that because many Muslims, according to this principle, see Islam as an holistic, encompassing worldview, right? They don't separate religion and politics. That's the idea here. Therefore, we shouldn't really understand Islam as a religion like Christianity is. We should really understand this as a political ideology, and as an ideology that's sort of coming to take over.
It's not a religion, it's a way of life.
Right. Right. And you will encounter many Muslims in the world who might say that. It's interesting how this is employed, though. So one of the things I studied some years ago was in Switzerland in 2009, they banned minarets. Minarets are the prayer towers. First European country to ban an Islamic worship structure. You cannot build a minaret. You can build a steeple, but you cannot build a minaret in Switzerland, right? The Swiss People's Party, which is the far-right party that led this charge, one of their arguments that they used pretty persuasively was that to the Swiss people, because this was a referendum, the Swiss always do referendums, as they were going to the polls, hey, if you're worried about infringing upon the freedom of religion of Muslims, don't worry about it. Why? Because Islam is not a religion. So you don't have to worry about freedom of religion for Muslims because they don't view what they have as religion anyway. You see how this argument can be used to restrict freedom of religion and other rights that the Muslims might have. The lack of any basis for criticizing the West, that Muslims don't have a right, if you will, or the perception is among Westerners, they don't have a right to critique Western foreign policy, for example, or Middle East policy, that sort of thing. That their criticisms aren't legitimate because of all this other stuff. Because they're prone to violence, prone to terrorism, that sort of thing. They warrant greater discrimination. This goes to everything that you guys do, right? Why is the starting point that if you're a Muslim, you're already sort of suspected of being guilty of something, or we need to entrap you in order to make sure we can kind of flesh that out, is because of this idea, right? It's part of this Islamophobic sort of mentality. And that Muslims in Islam are simply deserving of hostility. Again, that sort of fits in with a lot of these others. These are very much overlapping building blocks. This is a critique of Islamophobia. I just need to let you know I study this and talk about this enough to know that I get pushback sometimes, whether I'm making this up. The word Islamophobia, that's just a made-up sort of thing, right? A phenomenon that doesn't really exist. It's progressive hypes that are just sort of creating this out of nothing. The guy who wrote this statement is a guy named Daniel Pipes. Have you heard of him? Yeah. Yeah, he kind of is he's an interesting fellow in the fact that he's got a background. He's a Ph.D. from Harvard in Middle East Studies, right? So he's what we call in circles that I work in terms of scholarship, a rogue scholar. He's using his scholarship, and then he turns around and he sort of employs it against Muslims. But here's his critique. What exactly constitutes an undue fear of Islam when Muslims acting in the name of Islam today make up the premier source of worldwide aggression, verbal and physical, versus non-Muslims and Muslims alike? Muslims should dispense with the discredited term Islamophobia and instead engage in some earnest introspection. Notice that he's saying if there are some Muslims out there committing violence, all Muslims need to do some introspection. It's their problem. That is a classic, in my opinion, Islamophobic move. There's Al-Qaeda. Whatever Al-Qaeda is doing, the rest of Muslims are somehow culpable of this, and you need to turn inward and start to fix this. This is the rest of his statement. Rather than blame the potential victim for fearing his would-be executioner, that's what Muslims are, would-be executioners. Now you want to know why there's preemptive prosecutions? They would do better to ponder how Islamists have transformed their faith into an ideology celebrating murder and develop strategies to redeem their religion, because their religion is the problem, right? By combating this morbid totalitarianism. There are lots of statements like this, lots of pushback from bloggers, some on the far right, both in Europe and the United States and North America, that really are calling into question whether there is any such thing as Islamophobia. So people like me, we have our work cut out for us, but I hear it sometimes. I get this kind of feedback. Thanks.
Is it questioning whether it should exist, or is it saying, of course there's Islamophobia, that's the way things should be?
That they're going to challenge the word. It's not a phobia, because they think that phobia oftentimes connotates some sort of psychological disorder or whatever, right? This is something like that, and say, no. If Americans are afraid of Muslims, it must be legitimate because Islam itself is the problem. Therefore, get rid of the phrase Islamophobia. There is no phobia. We don't have an undue fear of anything. Of course we should be afraid. Haven't you seen what Muslims do? All Muslims, therefore, must be objects of fear. Why the rise in Islamophobia? I wish I had more time. This is a very, very long history, going back probably to the rise of Islam in the 7th and 8th century, but particularly the Crusades, in the 11th century onward, where Europe and Islam, we have really competing civilizations here, in terms of political power and among other things, and there are all sorts of negative constructions of Islam and Muslims going back that far. So there's a long history of the West fearing Islam for a variety of reasons. I'm not saying what happened in the 12th century is the same as what's happening in the 21st century. I'm simply saying that there are deep historical roots to this tension, right? And what has changed has been the circumstances. But more recently, in the latter half of the 20th century, with globalization, immigration, migration, Islam is no longer this exotic religion out there somewhere that once upon a time only missionaries encountered, or the empires of Britain or France when they were expanding. Islam has sort of come home, or come back to the West. So this is certainly the case in Europe, where in the mid-20th century, at the end of World War II, there weren't, in most parts of Europe, that many Muslims. And today, there's a lot. In the EU, there's probably some 15 million Muslims, residents, or people with a Muslim background. So with that comes greater visibility of Islam at home, and with greater visibility comes a bit more anxiety. And of course, all these events too, it's not just a post 9/11 sort of phenomenon in many ways, but you think of the second half of the 20th century, all these events, among others, I just chose 7, right, but I could have named more, have really fed this narrative that Islam and the West are involved in some sort of inherent conflict. The story I often tell some audiences when I speak on this topic, and the question I like to ask audiences sometimes is, think back, if you're not Muslim, think back to the first time you ever encountered in any shape or form a Muslim. And for me, I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, which doesn't have a lot of Muslims, at least it didn't in the 70s or 80s, but it had some. But my first encounter with a Muslim was a man named Ayatollah Khomeini on TV. I didn't know who he was. I was a kid at the time. I just knew that there was this really angry man always yelling at us. And that in probably in ways I couldn't sort of put together at the time, he was the stand-in for Muslims and the stand-in for Islam. Of course, I'm much older now, and I recognize the way media covers Islam and stories pertaining to Muslims and that sort of stuff, and how unnuanced much of the news is when it comes to Middle Eastern affairs and that sort of thing. But that being aside, setting aside, we keep in mind that these perceptions, these sort of first impressions, if you will, of Muslims are significant. For someone like me, that was it. And then, of course, I watched James Bond movies and stuff like that, right? So I learned who the Muslim enemy was through television and through the media. And you can live in Mobile, Alabama, and still encounter Muslims in this age of the media, right? But I would say after that, the Rushdie affair, this is particularly in Europe, when I was growing up as a teenager, was this big turning point too. This is probably the first instance in the West in which Westerners started to recognize, oh wait, there are Muslims in our midst. This was initially an internal British affair, was it not? It became a global affair after the Ayatollah Khomeini got involved in this one as well. But it started in Britain. And all these other events, but of course the turning point in some ways is 9/11 in terms of the ratcheting up of Islamophobia and the implications of that. The London and Madrid train bombings, the Danish cartoon controversy. I could have rattled off a lot more than that. But you're starting to see these events. Every time something like this happens, it gets fed back into this narrative of Islam in the West and sort of being at each other's throats, right? It reinforces that. And every time that happens, Muslim Americans, Muslims in Europe, they have these struggles. They become objects of greater scrutiny. So this might have been an event carried out by a very small group of Muslims, say these bombings in Madrid or London, but all Muslims sort of get implicated. Even when Muslims aren't doing these sorts of terrorist acts. Breivik in Norway. The initial news report was, this looks like a Muslim. Timothy McVeigh, Oklahoma City. The initial reports was, this looks like what?
Right.
I got
that was to hit the news right away.
This has all the traits of a Middle Eastern attack. How terrorists work in the Middle East. That was the initial news report. Right. And so even you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Any time there is a terrorist type act or violent killing, even when Muslims are not involved, just for those few moments, minutes, hours when the media speculates that Muslims might be involved, all Muslims become victimized again. They're going to get hit one way or the other. And this is part of the larger problem, I think, of Islamophobia. It's not simply due to some terrorist acts that Muslims do carry out. They get brought back into the story even when they're not involved at all. Even when it's a tall Norwegian man, looks like he walked off a Viking ship, right? These are the casualties, some of which we've already talked about tonight: the preemptive prosecution, the detentions, deportations, racial profiling. This is kind of stuff I do some more research on, at least in Europe. Mosque and minaret conflicts is one of the areas I've been studying in Europe. You know, when there's resistance to the building of mosques or minarets, and of course we've seen that here in the U.S. with Ground Zero and Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and other types of places. Here's just a picture that does not come out good on this. This is a protest for the Ground Zero Mosque, if you remember that a couple of years ago. And these are sort of signs about the fear of Sharia law. You can't see it well in this picture, but this is blood dripping off of these letters. You're supposed to get the sense that you allow Muslims to build this Islamic center, you're going to introduce Sharia law, and Muslims will take over. All right. I can go through a couple of these polls real quick, and then we'll have discussion. I think this is just interesting to introduce audiences too, and the color is a little off in this, but if you ask Americans what is your opinion of each religion, and Islam is going to be this one on the left. It's darker, it's hard to tell here. But you can see that 31% of Americans would say they don't have a favorable impression of Islam. Not too favorable, just a little bit about 20%. So over half of Americans, over 50% of Americans, either have an unfavorable impression of Islam or not too favorable, compared to, of course, Christianity, which apparently Americans love, right?
Big surprise.
Yeah, not a shocker, I know. What do you know? How much do you know about Islam? So how much is Islamophobia fed by just a lack of knowledge about Islam, right? And so you see Americans who would say a great deal, hasn't changed all that much. There was a little bit of a spike here and there in the post 9/11 era, and Americans started to get a little bit more curious, and then by 2010, almost 9% say they would know a great deal. a little over a third, some, but significant numbers of Americans, percentages of Americans know very little about Islam. And this will be important when we look at the next slide. Do you personally know a Muslim? All right, so almost 2/3 of Americans do not know a Muslim. I mean, are there's any correlation between these? I mean, that's debatable, but it's certainly interesting that there's certainly significant Islamophobia in the United States, and yet we have a lot of Americans who know very little about the religion and who don't have much personal relationships with Muslims at all. And this is the last slide. I think is just fascinating. It's from a 2010 Gallup poll. When asked by religious group people who identify with these different religious communities, do you think it's sometimes justifiable for the military to target and kill civilians? 78% of Muslims say it's never justified. Compared to many of the Christian groups, Jewish atheists come a little bit closer to Muslims, but particularly Protestants and Catholics are much more prone to say, yeah, that sometimes is justifiable. The perception would be the opposite. The assumption would be the opposite. Muslims, of course, would want to use military attacks or whatever to target and kill civilians. But in fact, Muslim Americans, at least, that's not the case at all, at least according to the Gallup poll, whereas with Protestants and Catholics, that's changed. Only in this agnostic atheist none category do you have something that's at least close to Muslims on this. So that's just to give you a little bit of background on this topic. I mean, that's a bird's eye view of it. That's all I think I can do. Trying to, I think, frame the other two presentations in terms of why might there be so much anxiety toward Muslims? Where does some of this come from? What feeds it? And why is this a difficult cycle to break out of? And to me, I assume this is going to be a lifetime work for me. I will die still trying to fight for a better conversation about Muslims. I'll end with this story. A couple of years ago, I was asked by a university here in the Upper Midwest to come speak and to moderate a conversation about the Ground Zero controversy, the Islamic Center being built there. So I agreed. It was the Muslim Student Association that invited me. So I drove up there, got there the night before. The president of the Muslim Student Association calls me, and he is welcoming me to campus, and he says, Dr. Green, I just need to let you know that the campus security contacted me today, and they decided they want to have an increased campus security presence at your event tomorrow. And I said, okay. You got to keep in mind, I'm a historian. I don't normally need extra muscle at any of my events. I just need to keep people awake, right?
You don't carry your gun permit?
I'm not used to having those kind of phone calls. But I was like, okay, if that's what the campus security wants, that sure. So then the next day comes, the event comes, and I show up at the auditorium about 15 minutes early, and the president of the Muslim Student Association greets me, and we have a nice little chat. And then one more thing he says. He says, Dr. Green, after consulting further with the campus police, they have advised me, the president of the Muslim Student Association, not to introduce you, so that I don't become a target for anyone in the community who might want to retaliate should they not like this event or the way this conversation goes. So can you introduce yourself? Plus, I was going to be leaving town later that day, right? Now, the reason I tell that story is simply, again, I'm a historian of all things. I've spoken at many other events. I speak all the time, obviously, in my classes. I don't ever have campus security come in to protect me. Why did I have to have all this in this event? And to me, it's because we are still unable in the United States and really throughout the West to have a rational, calm discourse about Islam. And that is a huge problem. And just to mediate a conversation in a college campus about what's going on in New York City with this proposed Islamic Center, that we had to have all that extra security and all this tension sort of ratcheted up for a boring historian to come in and talk about it. That says nothing about me. These people didn't really know much about me. It says a lot about this topic. Thanks.
Thank you. I have one more question.
Can I just say one thing about when Mel was talking about preemptive prosecutions? The genesis of this was has been attributed to Dick Cheney, and his 1% doctrine. And that was, if there is a 1% chance that somebody at some time in the future may do something to harm the United States, we have to treat it as 100% certainty. So that's the idea of preemptive prosecution. You go after them. You go after these people. You try to set up ways to.
He actually articulated that.
Yes, that yeah. Yeah. Look at it. Look, you can find it. You can hear him say it because he said it many times. Just look up the 1% doctrine.
Talk about
chain.
it.
Yeah, but if all people who
Institutionalized.
harm the United